Before his name echoed through nations, before plagues fell on Egypt, before seas split and mountains shook at the sound of God's voice, there was a baby, a fragile life held by a trembling mother who feared more for her son than for herself. This is the story of Moses. Not just a great leader, not just a prophet, not just a man who spoke with God face to face, but the story of a life preserved, shaped, and carried by the faithfulness of God from the moment he took his first breath.
Egypt was a land of astonishing beauty and unbearable cruelty. For generations, the descendants of Jacob, called the Hebrews, had multiplied and prospered there. But a new Pharaoh arose, one who didn't remember Joseph, one who didn't care for old alliances or ancient gratitude. He saw the growing Hebrew population and feared they would one day outnumber his own people. And fear is a dangerous seed when watered by power. So Pharaoh enslaved the Hebrews, forcing them to build his monuments, to labor under scorching sun, to live with the taste of dust and sorrow. But even in chains, the Hebrews grew. They flourished. They multiplied. Fear burned hotter in Pharaoh's heart, so he issued one of the darkest orders in the ancient world. Every Hebrew boy born must be thrown into the Nile. Imagine the sound of that decree echoing through villages, the horror, the disbelief, the mothers clutching their infants at night, praying God would hide them from the soldiers who tore cries from homes. Yet in the midst of that terror, God's faithfulness was already writing a different story. And it began with a woman of courage and a tiny basket made of reeds. Jochebed held her newborn son and knew she couldn't keep him hidden forever. His cries grew stronger each day, and soldiers roamed closer. So she did the unthinkable. She let him go. She coated a small basket with tar so it would float. She wrapped her baby in cloth, and she placed him on the river that had become a grave for countless Hebrew boys. But the river that destroyed others would deliver him, because God was faithful. The basket drifted past reeds and birds, past fishermen and sunlight dancing on the water, until it reached the very place no Hebrew women would dare hope for, the bathing grounds of Pharaoh's daughter. She opened the basket and saw the crying child. And Scripture says she had compassion. The princess of Egypt, the daughter of the man who ordered Hebrew babies to be killed, felt compassion for this one. This is how quietly God can overturn the darkest plans of kings, with a basket, a baby, and compassion. The princess decided to raise the child as her own. But a baby needs a nurse. And so, by God's extraordinary orchestration, Moses was brought back to his own mother to be nursed and raised in his earliest years. Jochebed held his son again, the child she thought she had lost, and she was paid by Egypt's royal household to care for him. God's faithfulness is not always loud. Sometimes it's hidden in timing, in compassion, in impossible coincidences. When Moses grew older, he was brought into Pharaoh's palace. He wore royal linen, learned royal language, ate royal food. But inside him, the echoes of his true identity remained. He was Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, a child rescued by God's design. And though he didn't yet know it, he was being prepared for a future unimaginable, a future that would shake empires, split seas, and reveal the faithfulness of God to an entire nation. And this is only the beginning. Moses' story is not just the rise of a leader. It is the unfolding of God's unwavering faithfulness to his people through danger, identity, calling, and redemption. And it all began with a single baby on the Nile, a child preserved because God had already written the next chapter. Moses grew up surrounded by marble pillars, silk garments, and the scent of rich oils. He dined with royalty, learned military strategy, mathematics, diplomacy, and the ways of Egyptian gods. He was groomed as a prince, a man of privilege in the world's most powerful empire. And yet, there was something restless in him, something that wouldn't settle. Perhaps it was the stories whispered to him as a child in his mother's arms, stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, stories of a promise, stories of a God who never forgets his people. That seed stayed in him. Even as he wore the gold of Egypt, he carried the memory of who he truly was. One day, Moses left the palace to see for himself the conditions of the Hebrews. He had heard whispers of their suffering, but nothing prepared him for what his eyes witnessed. He saw sunburned backs bent under impossible loads, women mixing clay with tears, men collapsing in the dust, while taskmasters' whips cracked through the air. The prince of Egypt stood among slaves, and something broke inside him. He could not pretend these were strangers. He could not pretend their pain was not his own blood. And then it happened. A moment that would change everything. Moses saw an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave. The man was defenseless, bleeding, barely upright. The overseer struck with cruelty, with rage, with no hesitation. Moses looked around. No one else was near. Something surged in him, rage at injustice, compassion for the beaten man, desperation to stop the violence. He stepped forward and struck the Egyptian. One blow, one moment, one irreversible act. The overseer fell. His body went limp. The desert fell silent. Moses had killed him. Fear swept through him, but it wasn't just fear for himself. It was the weight of what he had done. He buried the body in the sand, hoping the wind would hide it. But secrets buried shallow never stay hidden for long. The next day, Moses saw two Hebrews fighting each other. He tried to intervene. "Why are you striking your fellow Hebrew?" But one man snapped back, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Will you kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The words struck Moses like a thunderbolt. His secret was known. And if the Hebrews knew, the palace would know soon enough. News travels fast in an empire built on fear. Soon Pharaoh heard, and he was furious. To him, Moses was no prince worth protecting. He was now a criminal, a condemned man. Moses fled. No farewell, no turning back, just fear pounding beneath his ribs as he ran from the only home he ever knew. From palace to fugitive, from prince to exile. And yet, this moment of collapse was also a moment of divine redirection, because God often begins his greatest works at the end of our strength. The desert stretched before Moses, endless, harsh, indifferent. Sandstorms raged, heat scorched his skin, nights froze him to the bone, and through it all, he walked alone. But God was not finished with him, not even close. In the wilderness, Moses found a well, a place of rest, of water, of life. There he defended a group of women from hostile shepherds, and in doing so, he found welcome. They brought him to their father, Jethro, a priest of Midian. And for the first time in a long time, Moses felt something like peace. He married Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. He became a shepherd, a quiet, humble life far from the noise of Egypt. He tended flocks, walked mountain paths, listened to the wind. Years passed, enough years for Egypt to forget his name, enough years for Moses to believe that his story had ended in the desert. But God's faithfulness does not follow human timelines. What Moses thought was the end was only the preparation. Because one day, while walking alone on Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, Moses would see something that would turn his quiet life upside down. A fire that burned but did not consume. A voice that called his name. The moment that would change history forever was about to unfold. Moses had walked these mountains many times. For years, he led his flock through the same ridges, the same trails, the same lonely paths. The wilderness had become familiar, almost comforting. But on this day, something unfamiliar pierced the ordinary. He saw flames, not lightning, not a brush fire swept by the wind. No, this was different. A bush engulfed in fire, yet not burning away. The flames danced, but the branches did not crumble. It was as if the fire itself was alive, breathing, waiting, inviting. Moses stepped closer. Curiosity pulled him forward. A shepherd approaching an impossible sight, not knowing he was approaching destiny. Then a voice broke through the stillness. Not like thunder, not like wind. It was personal. It spoke his name. Moses, Moses. The shepherd froze. Everything in him trembled, yet something deeper, something ancient, felt awakened. He answered the only way a human can respond to a divine summons. Here I am. Then the voice said something that must have shattered him to the core. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. On a mountain of dirt and stone, God declared a moment holy. And Moses, barefoot, trembling, dust on his skin, knew this was no ordinary encounter. The voice continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At those words, Moses hid his face. The God of the covenant, the God who made promises long before Moses was born, was standing before him in flame. God told Moses that he had seen the oppression of his people in Egypt. He had heard their cries, felt their suffering, and remembered his promises. Then came the words Moses never expected. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. A shepherd who ran from Egypt. A fugitive with a stained past. A man who once acted in rage. Was this the man God would send to confront the most powerful king on earth? Moses' heart pounded, his mind raced, and out of his fear came his first protest. Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh? But God's response didn't reassure him with compliments or titles. Instead, God said something greater. I will be with you. Moses wasn't the hero. God was. And God himself was promising to walk with him. Still, Moses hesitated. What if they ask your name? And God spoke a revelation so vast, so holy, it still echoes through time. I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. The eternal, the ever-present, the one who simply is. This was the God who called him. But Moses wasn't done with his doubts. What if they don't believe me? What if they don't listen? I am slow in speech. I cannot speak well. Fear can create 1,000 excuses, even in the presence of holy fire. But God met every fear with faithfulness. He gave Moses signs, A staff that would become a serpent, a hand that could turn leprous and be healed again, water that would become blood. God removed every obstacle except the one Moses clung to most, his own insecurity. Finally, Moses said, "Please, Lord, send someone else." But God, patient yet firm, told Moses that his brother Aaron would speak with him. Moses would lead, Aaron would support, and God would empower them both. The bush still burned. The air still hummed with holy presence. And Moses realized something undeniable. God wasn't choosing him because he was strong. God was choosing him because he was faithful. Sandals in hand, staff trembling in his grip, Moses walked down the mountain. The sky stretched wide above him. The calling of God weighed heavily on his shoulders, yet also did the promise, "I will be with you." The shepherd turned prophet was walking back towards the land he fled, back toward Pharaoh, back toward slavery, injustice, danger. Not because he was ready, but because God was. And through Moses, God was about to reveal his faithfulness in ways the world had never seen.
Moses returned to Egypt not as a prince, not as a fugitive, not even as a shepherd, but as a messenger of the living God. His heart must have raced as the palace gates rose before him again. Years had passed, but the memories had not. Every pillar, every courtyard, every echo of the palace stirred fragments of a life he once lived, a life he walked away from. Now he walked toward it with purpose, Aaron at his side, a staff in his hand, and God's command burning in his spirit. They were ushered into the presence of Pharaoh, a ruler whose throne symbolized absolute power. Pharaoh's gaze was sharp, unwavering, dripping with the confidence of a man who believed himself divine. Then Moses spoke the words that would ignite a spiritual and political war. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." The court fell silent. Priests froze. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Pharaoh's expression hardened, and with a cold, dismissive tone, he answered, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." To Pharaoh, the God of slaves was no God at all, but he was about to learn that the God he dismissed was the God who created the very breath in his lungs. When Pharaoh refused, the oppression grew harsher. He increased the slaves' workload, broke their spirits, and blamed Moses for their suffering. The Hebrews cried out, not just in pain, but in frustration at Moses himself. And Moses, discouraged, cried out to God, "Why have you sent me? Ever since I came, things have only gotten worse." Yet God answered with a promise. Pharaoh would see God's power, not just in words, but in undeniable acts. Then came the first sign. Moses cast his staff before Pharaoh, and it became a serpent, a direct challenge to Egypt's symbols of authority. Pharaoh's magicians imitated the act, but Moses' serpent swallowed theirs whole. The message was clear. God's power was not just greater, it consumed every imitation. Still, Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and so began the plagues. The Nile turned to blood, fish died, the river stank, and the lifeline of Egypt became poison. Frogs swarmed every corner of the nation, homes, beds, ovens, temples. Gnats rose from the dust, a plague so overwhelming that even the magicians said, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh would not yield. Flies came next, thick, suffocating swarms that spared only the land of the Hebrews. Disease struck livestock, boils erupted on skin, hail rained down with thunder that shattered stone. Locusts devoured what remained. Darkness swallowed the land for 3 whole days, a living, breathing darkness that felt like judgment. Each plague chipped away at the gods of Egypt, the Nile god, the cattle god,
the sky gods, the sun god. God demonstrated, again and again, that he alone held creation in his hands. But the final plague would break Egypt completely. God told Moses that the angel of death would pass through the land, striking down every firstborn son, from the throne of Pharaoh to the servants behind the millstones. But the Hebrews were given instructions for protection. Sacrifice a lamb, cover the doorposts with its blood, stay inside, trust God's promise. This night became known as Passover, a night marked not by fear, but by obedience and faith. When the angel swept through Egypt, a cry rose that shook the kingdom. Pharaoh's own son was gone. The gods he trusted had failed. His pride lay shattered in the dust. He summoned Moses and said the words the Hebrews longed to hear. "Go, take your people, leave Egypt." The Hebrews, after generations of slavery, walked out free. Not as fugitives, not as rebels, but as a nation delivered by the faithfulness of God. They carried silver and gold given by the Egyptians themselves. They carried their children, their hope, their future. And as they left, a pillar of cloud appeared before them, God Himself guiding their steps. Egypt had fallen silent, but the wilderness ahead was not silent at all. It was alive with God's presence, and filled with a future Israel could never imagine. The story of Moses was moving toward its greatest moment, a moment that would define faith for generations. A sea stood in their path, an army was rising behind them, and God's faithfulness was about to turn the impossible into a pathway.
When the Hebrews left Egypt, they did not leave quietly. They walked out in vast numbers. Families, children, elders, flocks, a river of people moving toward a promise they had never seen but desperately longed for. And God went before them, a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night, a visible sign of God's presence guiding every step. Imagine that. The same God who called Moses at the burning bush was now lighting the night sky for an entire nation. But freedom did not erase Egypt's pride. Pharaoh, overwhelmed by grief and rage, realized what he had allowed. "Why did we let them go?" he roared. He summoned his chariots, the greatest military force on earth, and thundered into the desert in pursuit of the Hebrews. Dust rose behind the horses like a storm. The earth shook under the pounding of wheels. The Hebrews heard the distant roar, and fear rushed through the camp. They found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the waters of the Red Sea. Mountains on one side, sea on the other. No path forward, no escape behind. Panic spread. Cries filled the air. Some shouted at Moses, "Why did you bring us here to die? We were better off in Egypt." Fear can make the past seem safer than the future. But Moses, once a frightened shepherd, stood strong. He raised his staff and said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring today." Then God spoke, "Tell the people to move forward." Forward? Toward the sea? Toward impossible? But faith often begins where logic ends. The pillar of cloud moved behind the Hebrews, blocking the Egyptians with a supernatural darkness. And Moses lifted his staff over the water. A wind rose from the east, gentle at first, then fierce, then mighty. The sea trembled, the waters pulled back, waves rose like towering walls on each side, and a path carved itself through the depth. Dry ground where ocean had been moments before. The Hebrews stepped forward, hesitant at first, then faster, walking between curtains of water that shimmered in moonlight. Children clung to their parents. Elders leaned on staffs. Flames from the pillar lit the path, and the impossible became reality. When Pharaoh's army saw the opened sea, they charged in after them. But once the Hebrews reached the far shore,
God told Moses to stretch out his hand again. The waters crashed down. Chariots vanished in a roaring wave. The greatest army on earth was swept away in moments. The Hebrews stood on the opposite shore, watching the sea close behind them, a divine full stop on centuries of slavery. Freedom wasn't just a dream now, it was their reality. The people burst into song, a song that echoed across generations. Moses sang of God's strength, God's justice, God's unfailing faithfulness. His sister Miriam lifted a tambourine and led the women in dance, their steps celebrating a God who does not abandon his people even when the path leads through the impossible. But the journey wasn't over. It was only beginning. The wilderness tested them. Hunger tested them. Thirst tested them. Doubt tested them. And Moses again and again mediated between the people and God. At Mount Sinai, thunder rolled across the peaks. Fire descended. The mountain shook violently. And God spoke his law, a covenant for a freed nation. Moses stood on the mountain for 40 days, receiving the commandments, listening to God's voice. Even when the people turned to idols and lost their way, God remained faithful, disciplining them, forgiving them, leading them still. Moses' life became intertwined with the story of God's relentless promise, a promise to be present, to guide, to protect, to forgive, to remain faithful when his people were faithless. From the Nile to the burning bush, from Pharaoh's court to the Red Sea, from wilderness wandering to the edge of the Promised Land, the thread running through Moses' life was not Moses' strength, but God's faithfulness. This is what makes Moses' story timeless. He wasn't chosen because he was fearless. He wasn't chosen because he was perfect. He wasn't chosen because he was powerful. He was chosen because God keeps his promises. And God took a man who once ran from his past and turned him into a leader who walked boldly toward the future, because God was with him. This is the heart of Moses' story, a faithful God guiding an imperfect man to lead a newly freed nation toward a promise bigger than they could imagine. Moses died on Mount Nebo, seeing the promised land from afar. He never entered it, but the people he led did. And his legacy remains not because he was extraordinary, but because his God is. A God who hears, a God who remembers, a God who rescues, a God who remains faithful from generation to generation.
As we look back on Moses' journey, from a baby hidden among the reeds to a leader who walked with God through fire, water, and wilderness, we're reminded of something deeply comforting. The faithfulness of God never fades. Every step Moses took was guided. Every obstacle he faced was met with divine strength. Every moment of fear became an opportunity for God to show his power. And that same faithfulness continues today. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the hope found in God's promises, I'd love for you to stay connected. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can discover these powerful stories of faith, courage, and the God who never leaves his people behind. Thank you for watching, and may you walk in the same faithful guidance that carried Moses through every season of his life.